The night was wrapped in fog when a humble seamstress found a lost child by the cliffs of Newport, a boy whose name she didn't know, and whose father would change her destiny forever. In a world ruled by power and appearances, one act of compassion ignites a scandal that defies every rule of society. Behind the velvet walls of a tycoon's mansion, secrets whisper, reputations crumble, and two hearts must choose between duty and desire. Welcome to The Seamstress and the Heir, a story of love, courage, and redemption. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and tell me, do you believe love can truly conquer the world's judgment? Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1895. The ocean murmured below the cliffs, its rhythm steady and unfeeling, as if unaware of the sorrow and secrets it had carried through centuries. The mist clung to the jagged stones like a veil, softening the edges of the world, blurring the line between reality and dream. Brenda Collins walked alone along the narrow path that skirted the cliffs beyond the Bellevue mansions, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The day's work had left her fingers sore and her spirit quieter than usual. The scent of salt and wild roses drifted through the fog, mingling with the distant cry of gulls. She had taken the long way home, as she often did when her thoughts pressed too closely around her. Her boots crunched against the gravel, careful and measured. The road was familiar, but the air held something different that evening. A tension, a stillness that did not belong to nature. And then, just beyond the bend in the path, she saw him. A small boy, no more than 5 years of age, sat motionless on a flat rock near the edge of the cliff. His legs were drawn to his chest, his head lowered, and his clothing, though fine and once expensive, was damp with mist and slightly torn at the sleeve. He looked utterly alone, like a porcelain figure left behind after a storm. Brenda's heart stopped. She approached with slow caution, careful not to startle him. "Sweetheart," she murmured, kneeling a few steps away. "Where is your mother?" The boy didn't answer. He didn't even lift his face. But when she drew nearer, he turned slightly and reached out, not with panic, not with fear, but with aching, silent need. His fingers clutched the edge of her shawl as if it were the last thing tethering him to the world. Brenda took him into her arms, the way one gathers a wounded bird. His little body trembled, though he made no sound. She felt the heat of a fever against her neck and noticed the red flush along his cheeks. "Good Lord," she whispered. "What has happened to you?" He carried no coat, no hat, no shoes, only a small wooden toy train in his hand, its initials carved delicately into the side, H.H. She looked around, expecting to see a governess, a footman, a desperate parent running toward them through the fog. But no one came. The silence was unbearable. Cradling him carefully, Brenda stood and made her way back to her modest cottage on Crosswind Street, her skirts damp from the sea air. The boy never spoke, but once, in a near-sleep murmur, he whispered a single word against her collarbone. "Push." She paused, but the word was swallowed by the wind, and the child had already drifted into fevered slumber. That night, Brenda placed him in her own bed, layered with quilts stitched by her late mother. She sat beside him, wiping his forehead with cool water, humming old lullabies she hadn't sung in years. As the candlelight flickered against the walls, casting gentle shadows across the boy's sleeping face, something inside her shifted. She did not yet know his name. She did not know where he came from, or why he had been left alone in the mist. But as she watched over him, a strange and unspoken bond began to form, a thread of fate sewn in silence. And far across town, in a mansion of cold marble and locked doors, a man sat alone in a study lined with books and regret. A man with storm-colored eyes who had once had a son, and who had just lost him again. Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1895. The dawn crept gently across the narrow streets of the harbour town, washing the rooftops in soft gold. In Brenda Collins's modest cottage, the scent of warm porridge and lavender soap mingled with the salty air drifting in from the sea. She had slept little that night, her thoughts divided between the strange child who now slept under her roof and the unsettling word he had whispered before surrendering to fevered dreams. The boy, delicate, silent, and pale as the morning mist, still lay upon her bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. His small hand clutched the wooden toy train she had found with him, as though it were the key to another world. Brenda had sat beside him for hours, watching, praying that he might wake with answers. As the church bell of St. Mary struck 7, a distant rumble reached her ears, the rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestone. It grew louder, heavier, until the fragile window panes trembled in their frames. Startled, Brenda turned toward the small front door, just as the sound of wheels grinding to a halt pierced the stillness. Outside, the fog had not yet lifted. Through its silvery curtain, she saw a black carriage gleaming with polish, its brass fixtures shining even in the muted light. The driver, tall and rigid in posture, climbed down and adjusted his gloves before striking the door with a heavy knock that echoed through the tiny cottage. Brenda's heart quickened. She looked at the sleeping boy, then back at the door. Something inside her whispered that the peace of her humble life was about to end. When she opened the door, the morning light revealed a man unlike any she had ever seen in person, imposing, refined, and surrounded by the kind of authority that needed no announcement. His black coat was cut to perfection, his waistcoat ivory, his cravat crisp. A gloved hand held a walking cane tipped with silver, though he carried it more as a symbol than a support. "Good morning," he said, his voice low, firm, and measured. "I believe you have my son." For a moment Brenda could not speak. His words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Your son?" she managed to whisper. He stepped closer, his tall figure filling the doorway. "Henry Harrington. He was lost yesterday afternoon near the cliffs. My household has been searching through the night." The name struck her with quiet awe. She knew it well. Harrington was spoken in every tailor shop, every kitchen, every household of Newport. Edward Harrington, the railroad tycoon whose fortune could pave an empire, whose power had built the very city around them. She had seen his mansion only from afar, its marble facade cold as the ocean wind that swept across its lawns. Her gaze fell to the child, now awake, his wide blue eyes fixed on the man in the doorway. For an instant, silence stretched between father and son. Then the boy's fingers tightened around the wooden train, and his lips trembled, not with joy, but confusion. Brenda turned to Edward Harrington. "He was alone when I found him," she said softly. Cold and frightened, there was no one nearby. The man's jaw tightened, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "You should not have brought him here," he replied, not unkindly, but with the instinctive superiority of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. Brenda drew herself up, the faintest trace of defiance in her eyes. "He was freezing," she said. "Would you have preferred I left him on the cliffs?" For the first time, his expression shifted, not to anger, but to hesitation. He glanced down, adjusting the gloves at his wrist, then stepped past her into the small cottage. The contrast between his presence and her surroundings was almost painful. The polished leather of his shoes touched the worn floorboards, the gleam of his cufflinks reflected against the chipped wood of her table. Yet there was something grounding about the place, something warm, alive. The faint scent of chamomile lingered in the air, and a pot simmered gently on the stove. Henry remained silent, watching them both. Brenda bent beside him, her voice gentle. "This is your father, Henry." The boy's lips parted, but no words came. Only the echo of the same fragile silence that had haunted her through the night. Edward knelt, his polished cane resting against the bed frame. "Henry," he said, softer now. "You're safe. It's time to come home." But the child did not move toward him. He only looked at Brenda, his fingers clutching her sleeve. The smallest hint of uncertainty clouded the tycoon's face. He stood slowly, his gaze returning to Brenda. "He hasn't spoken." "Not a word," she answered. "Only once in his sleep, but I could not understand what he meant." Edward's eyes darkened at that. What did he say? Brenda hesitated, feeling the weight of the word in her memory. He said, "Push." For the first time, the colour drained slightly from Edward's face. He turned away, walking toward the window as if the fog outside might offer refuge from her gaze. His hand tightened around the silver handle of his cane until his knuckles whitened. When he spoke again, his voice was composed but distant. "I will take him now." Brenda looked down at the boy, who was clinging tighter to her arm. "He's still weak," she said quietly. "Perhaps it would be better if he rested a few hours more." "I have a physician waiting at the house," Edward replied. "He'll be cared for properly there." She nodded slowly. "Then allow me to accompany you, for his sake. The journey might frighten him less if I am near." Her offer surprised even her. It was bold, too bold for a woman in her position, but something about the child's silent fear stirred her beyond reason. Edward turned to her fully now. In the daylight, his face revealed more than authority. Lines of weariness traced the edges of his mouth and eyes, not of age, but of a man accustomed to solitude. "That won't be necessary," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded envelope. "You have done me a service, Miss Collins," she supplied. "Brenda Collins." "Miss Collins," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. He extended the envelope toward her. "Please accept this as compensation for your trouble." Brenda did not touch it. The gesture, though courteous, carried the sting of dismissal. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze with quiet steadiness. "I didn't help him for money, Mr. Harrington." He studied her for a moment, surprised by her refusal. Few people ever declined an offer from Edward Harrington. There was something disarming in her composure, an honesty that defied his expectations. "Then accept it as gratitude," he said finally. Her eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "Your gratitude is already in his safety, that's enough." For a long, suspended breath, neither spoke. The air between them was charged with something neither could name, a tension not born of anger but of recognition, as though they stood at the threshold of a conversation that neither dared begin. At last, Edward inclined his head slightly. "Very well." He turned toward the door, his voice lower now. "Driver." The servant appeared instantly, stepping into the room to lift Henry into his arms. The boy began to cry then, not loud, not wild, but with the quiet despair of a heart too young to understand loss. Brenda's throat tightened. Edward watched, his eyes flickering briefly toward her. "He'll be fine," he said, though his words sounded more like a hope than a truth. She followed them to the doorway. The fog had thickened again, wrapping the carriage in a pale haze. The driver helped Henry inside. Closing the door with a muted click, Edward placed one gloved hand on the frame before stepping in himself. "Miss Collins," he said, pausing, "you did the right thing. Newport needs more people who act on kindness rather than convenience." Brenda's lips curved faintly. "And perhaps Newport needs more men who notice it." For the first time, a shadow of a smile touched his face. Then, without another word, he entered the carriage. The horses started forward, their hooves clattering over the stones, the sound fading into the mist until only silence remained. Brenda stood alone on the threshold, her hands clasped before her. The morning had returned to stillness, yet everything felt changed. The echo of his voice lingered, as did the sight of the boy's tear-streaked face pressed against the carriage window. Inside her small cottage, the bed was empty now, but the air still carried the warmth of the child's presence, the fragile imprint of innocence against the weary heart of a woman who had never sought to be noticed. As she closed the door, she glanced once more at the path leading to the cliffs. Somewhere beyond that mist, in a house of marble and silence, the boy was being returned to a father whose eyes revealed more loneliness than power. Brenda did not know if she would ever see him again. Yet as she washed her hands and set about tidying the room, the rhythm of her heart refused to quiet. Something invisible had shifted that morning, something delicate and unspoken. like the faintest thread tugging two distant lives toward an inevitable crossing. The summer sun hovered low above the slate roofs of Newport, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and marble colonnades of the city's wealthiest estates. At the Harrington residence, nestled at the edge of a wind-swept bluff, the morning air was thick with tension, despite the stillness of the sea beyond. The mansion, with its towering windows and gleaming chandeliers, held its breath. Henry had not spoken since his return. The boy, once the light of the Harrington household, now lay curled in a canopied bed far too grand for his trembling frame. The fine linens that covered him had been pressed by expert hands, the silk drapes drawn just so to filter the morning light. Yet no nurse, no servant, no physician had managed to coax him into eating or even lifting his gaze. Edward Harrington stood by the doorway of his son's room, arms folded behind his back, his figure motionless. His cravat was impeccably tied, his morning coat brushed to perfection, but the worry in his eyes betrayed him. He was a man accustomed to control, to order, to a world that moved at his command, and yet before his own son, he was helpless. "He hasn't taken a single bite," said Mrs. Merton, the head nurse, wringing her hands. "He simply stares at the tray and turns his face to the wall. We've tried broth, eggs, even his favorite jam. Nothing." Edward's jaw tightened. He looked toward the boy, whose small face was turned toward the velvet-covered wall, lashes dark against a pale cheek. The toy train lay untouched on the side table. "Bring the carriage," he said at last. Later that afternoon, Brenda Collins stood in the doorway of her cottage, her hands still damp from rinsing out a basket of laundry. The sight of the Harrington carriage outside her gate filled her with a quiet dread. She had not expected to see him again, at least not so soon. The footman bowed politely. "Miss Collins, Mr. Harrington requests your presence. It's regarding the boy." Brenda dried her hands on her apron and nodded slowly. There was no fear in her, only a rising sense of inevitability. When she arrived at the estate, escorted through halls so grand they seemed carved from another world, she was greeted by silence and marble. The air inside the mansion was cool and heavy, scented faintly with roses and something older, something that lingered in the wallpaper and the long-forgotten corners of the rooms. Edward awaited her in the study, standing beside a tall window that opened toward the sea. He did not turn when she entered. "Thank you for coming," he said after a moment. "I came for Henry," she replied softly. He nodded once, still looking out. "He's refusing to eat, refusing to speak. The physicians have done all they can, and still he asks for you." Brenda's heart stirred at the quiet desperation in his voice. "I'll sit with him if you'll allow me." "I want more than that," he said, turning to face her now. His eyes met hers with gravity. "I want you to stay." The words hung in the air like smoke, unexpected and difficult to grasp. "I beg your pardon," she whispered. "Temporarily," he clarified, "until he recovers. You'll be compensated, of course. You'll have a private room, meals, whatever is necessary. All I ask is that you help him heal. Nothing else seems to reach him." Brenda felt her breath catch. The proposition was simple in words, yet the implications were anything but. A working-class seamstress housed within the estate of one of the most influential men in New England. It would be a scandal. Tongues would wag, rumors would spread like wildfire. Her fingers curled tightly around the ribbon of her reticule. "I care for Henry," she said, her voice steady, "but I won't be paraded around like some curious guest for the amusement of your household." "You won't be," Edward replied, his tone restrained. "You'll be treated with discretion and respect. I'll see to it myself." That he even offered such words told her how deep his concern truly ran. His pride, carefully guarded behind layers of tailored elegance and practiced detachment, was being set aside, if only slightly. "And if the staff disapproves?" she asked, not out of fear but out of foresight. "They already disapprove," he answered plainly. "They disapprove of anything they cannot understand." Brenda hesitated only a moment longer, then she spoke, quiet but firm. "I will stay." For Henry, but I set my own conditions. He arched an eyebrow. I keep my independence, she continued. I'm not your servant, and I will not be treated like one. I come and go from Henry's room as I see fit, and I answer only to the child's well-being, not to rules of decorum or social expectation. Edward considered this for a long breath. Then with a slight incline of his head he said, "Agreed." And just like that, the balance shifted. That evening Brenda was shown to a modest room in the eastern wing of the estate. It had once belonged to a visiting governess, long since gone. The window overlooked the sea, and the wallpaper, faded blue with silver vines, had begun to peel at the corners. But it was quiet, and hers. The servants regarded her with thinly veiled curiosity, some with disdain. Mrs. Pembroke's personal maid, who often visited the house on her mistress's behalf, whispered audibly in the corridor as Brenda passed. Still, Brenda held her head high. Henry's condition changed almost immediately. At the sound of her voice, he opened his eyes. At the touch of her hand, he accepted a spoonful of broth. At the sight of her smile, he smiled in return, faintly, but with a softness that had been absent for days. She read to him by the hour, her voice weaving through tales of distant lands and talking animals. She sewed new buttons on his coat. She sat with him by the tall window, pointing out the ships as they sailed into the harbour. Edward watched this transformation from afar. He often stood in the doorway of the boy's room, saying little, observing the tenderness that passed between his son and the woman who was not bound to him by name or blood, but by a kind of quiet grace. One evening, as Brenda adjusted the folds of a blanket across Henry's lap, Edward lingered longer than usual. "He's stronger," he murmured. "Yes," she said, "but the wound is still there. Whatever broke him, it runs deep." He nodded. "And yet you reach him when no one else can." Brenda didn't look at him. Children know who's truly listening, who's willing to stay without expecting anything in return. There was a pause. Then he said, "You remind me of someone." She turned. Their eyes met, his guarded, hers open. The air between them was still but dense with emotion unspoken. Neither moved, yet everything shifted in that instant. Outside, the sea whispered against the rocks. Within, the grand house stood tall, its walls beginning to remember the sound of laughter, the warmth of music, the softness of a woman's voice in the stillness of night. What neither of them knew then was that the moment Brenda stepped across that threshold, she had not simply entered a home. She had entered a story long dormant, a tapestry torn by grief and stitched anew by hands that had never meant to touch the heart of a tycoon. Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1895. The Harrington estate stood high above the sea like a marble fortress, its wide terraces gleaming in the morning light. The air carried the scent of salt and roses, and the endless rhythm of waves below rose through the cliffs like a faint heartbeat beneath the grand house. To any outsider, it was a palace of wealth and triumph, but to Brenda Collins, who now walked its polished corridors in silence, it felt more like a gilded cage. Every step she took echoed softly against the marble floors. The chandeliers glimmered above her, suspended from ceilings painted with golden vines and cherubs that smiled down from their celestial clouds. Yet despite the beauty that surrounded her, she could not escape the chill that clung to the walls, an unspoken sorrow that seemed to seep from the very stones of the house. Brenda had lived there for only 5 days, yet the rhythm of her days had already changed entirely. Her mornings began before sunrise, when the ocean mist still veiled the garden. She would check on Henry, who often woke from uneasy dreams, and read to him until his breathing calmed. By breakfast, she was met with the curious glances of servants, who could not quite decide whether to bow or to frown when she passed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Greaves, treated her with distant politeness. The maids whispered about her presence, some pitying, others scandalized. Yet Brenda bore it all with quiet dignity. She was there for Henry, Nothing more, she reminded herself each morning as she buttoned her modest grey gown and pinned her hair neatly beneath her lace cap. Still, she could not ignore the way Edward Harrington's eyes followed her sometimes, always discreetly, always from a distance. But there was an intensity there, a question he seemed afraid to ask. One afternoon, as Brenda sat by Henry's bedside reading from a collection of nautical tales, she felt his small hand slip into hers. His eyes, large and blue like his father's, were open but unfocused. "Did you dream again, my dear?" she asked softly. He nodded, barely whispering. Mamma fell. Brenda's breath caught. She looked at him gently, not wanting to alarm him. "You mean she fell in your dream?" Henry shook his head. "The cliff." She was crying. Then someone pushed her. The toy train he always carried lay on the coverlet, its little wheels glinting in the light. Brenda's heart ached. She knew children sometimes spoke in fragments between truth and imagination. Yet there was something in his voice, a quiet certainty, that sent a shiver through her. She smoothed his hair and kissed his forehead. "It's only a bad dream, Henry," she murmured. "You're safe now." But when she glanced toward the doorway, she saw Edward standing there, his expression unreadable. His eyes met hers for a moment, and though his face remained composed, she saw the faintest tremor in his jaw, the tightening of a hand against the doorframe. He had heard every word. Later that evening, after Henry had fallen asleep, Brenda walked down the west corridor toward her room. The corridor was dimly lit by a line of sconces, each reflecting in tall mirrors framed in gilt. Her footsteps were soft, her thoughts heavy. Halfway down, she paused before a set of double doors she had never seen open, the late Mrs. Harrington's chambers. The doors were covered in a thin film of dust, and one of the brass handles had tarnished to a dull brown. A maid hurried past, carrying linens, and froze when she saw Brenda near them. "You mustn't go in there, miss," the maid whispered, lowering her voice. "Mr. Harrington keeps it locked. It's been untouched since the accident." Brenda nodded but said nothing. When the maid hurried away, she placed her hand briefly against the door. The wood was cold beneath her palm, as though the room beyond still belonged to another time. That night, as the wind rattled the tall windows, she found herself unable to sleep. The words Henry had spoken echoed faintly in her mind. She lit a candle and opened the small journal she had brought with her from her cottage, the one where she often sketched or noted her thoughts. Her handwriting trembled slightly as she wrote, "The house feels like it is grieving. Henry dreams of falling. Edward hides his sorrow behind silence. There is truth buried beneath this marble, and someday it will surface." A faint knock startled her. She quickly closed the book. The door opened, and Edward stood there in his dark waistcoat, the light from the hallway outlining his figure. He looked tired, older perhaps, though his composure never faltered. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "The light under your door caught my attention." Brenda rose from her chair. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "The sea is restless tonight." He nodded, stepping closer. "It's always restless here. Some nights I think it remembers more than it should." There was something strange about hearing such a confession from a man like him, a man whose every gesture spoke of power and restraint. She studied his face, the shadows under his eyes, the fine line of his mouth. "Henry spoke of his mother," she said quietly. "He said she fell, that she was pushed." Edward's shoulders stiffened, though his gaze did not waver. "Children dream of many things." "Yes," Brenda replied gently, "but sometimes dreams hold pieces of truth." He turned from her then, walking toward the window. The candlelight cast his profile in soft amber. "You think me a man haunted by scandal, Miss Collins." "I think you're a man haunted by something," she said. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was intimate, fragile. He looked back at her, his eyes searching hers with a weariness that startled her. For a moment, she thought he might say more. Instead, he only bowed his head slightly and murmured, "Good night." When he was gone, Brenda sank back into her chair, her heart unsteady. She had seen grief before, among widows, among the poor, but Edward Harrington's sorrow carried a different weight. It was grief wrapped in guilt. The next morning, a sudden storm rolled in from the Atlantic, darkening the sky and shaking the windows with gusts of wind. Henry clung to Brenda's arm, frightened by the thunder. They sat by the fire in the nursery as rain streaked down the glass panes like tears. Edward entered quietly, his coat damp from the outdoors. "He'll be all right," Brenda said softly. "It's just the weather." But Edward didn't seem to hear her. His gaze lingered on the child, then on Brenda herself. Something about the sight of them, her gentle hand resting on Henry's shoulder, unraveled him. He cleared his throat as though to speak, but the words never came. Later that day, Brenda wandered into the conservatory, a vast room of glass walls and ivy-draped columns. It was one of the few places in the house that felt alive. She breathed in the scent of earth and green leaves, letting it soothe her. As she reached out to touch a vine, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, startled, to find Edward standing there again, silent as ever. "I come here when I can't think," he said quietly. "The house becomes suffocating." "I can understand that," Brenda replied, meeting his gaze. "So much beauty, and yet such coldness." He smiled faintly. "You see it too." And they stood there, surrounded by the sound of rain against glass. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Brenda could feel the faint quickening of her pulse, the tension that lived in the space between them. Something neither of them had invited, but both could feel. He stepped closer, not enough to breach propriety, but close enough that she could sense the warmth beneath his restraint. His eyes softened, the sharp edges of his authority dissolving into something human, vulnerable. "You've brought life back into this place," he said. "I see it in Henry, and perhaps in myself." Her breath caught, but she managed to answer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I'm grateful, Mr. Harrington, because I see it too." He inclined his head, as if acknowledging something wordless between them, and left her there beneath the glass dome. Brenda watched him go, her heart both heavier and lighter at once. She turned back to the garden, to the vines glistening with droplets of rain, and let out a quiet breath she had not realized she was holding. In that moment, she understood that something within the Harrington estate was changing. Not just the air, not just the silence, but the very balance of the lives within it. And though she could not yet name it, she felt the truth pressing near, waiting for the courage of hearts unguarded to finally bring it to light. Newport, Rhode Island, late summer of 1895. The sun hung low over the estate that afternoon, casting long amber streaks across the stone pathways and ivy-covered walls. The breeze carried the scent of salt and earth, stirred faintly by the whisper of distant waves. Within the estate's far western wing, tucked behind overgrown hedges and wrought-iron gates, lay a forgotten garden. Its walls were hidden by tangled vines, and its stone benches worn smooth by time. Most of the servants avoided it. Even Mrs. Greaves spoke of it only in hushed tones, as if it held memories too fragile to disturb. Brenda discovered it by accident. She had gone in search of a quiet place to read to Henry, but the boy had fallen asleep early that day, and her own heart felt restless. Wandering past the conservatory, she noticed the gate slightly ajar and followed the gravel path through a curtain of climbing roses. What she found was not the grandeur of the estate's formal gardens, but something more intimate, more human, a secret corner of the world where life had once bloomed without design. Time had softened its edges. Bushes leaned into each other like old friends. Ivy curled around the arms of a forgotten marble cherub. The sun fell in golden patches across the mossy ground, and between two laurel trees stood the remains of a once proud rosebush, now half buried beneath the earth, its thorns tangled and wild. Brenda knelt beside it, brushing away the dry leaves. One bloom remained, curled and pale, but alive. She touched it gently, the petals like silk against her fingers. "She planted it," said a voice behind her. She turned swiftly, startled. Edward stood at the entrance of the garden, his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. He wore a dark grey frock coat and a silver cravat, the light catching the edges of his profile as he stepped closer. "This was her garden," he continued. "Annabel, my wife." Brenda stood slowly, brushing the soil from her skirt. "It's beautiful, even like this." He nodded, his gaze lowered. "She designed it herself. Spent hours out here, planting, pruning, writing letters on that bench. I hadn't come here since the funeral." The word hung heavy in the air between them, thick with memory. Brenda's voice softened. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have entered without asking." "No," he said, "I'm glad someone came." A silence settled between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was filled with the rustle of leaves, the quiet hum of insects, and something more fragile, something unspoken that hovered between their glances. "She used to call this her sanctuary," he said after a moment. "Said it was the only place where she could breathe." Brenda looked at him, truly looked. The weight of his shoulders, the faint crease at the corner of his mouth, the way his eyes seemed to rest not on the present, but on some unreachable past. She realized then that Edward Harrington was a man carved by grief, shaped not just by fortune, but by loss. "She must have loved deeply," Brenda whispered. "She did," he answered, his voice low. "But I don't think I ever knew how to love her in return. At least, not the way she needed." Brenda stepped closer, drawn not by boldness, but by compassion. "Sometimes we don't realize what we have until it's gone." His eyes met hers, and something flickered there. Pain, regret, longing. "And sometimes," he said quietly, "we only begin to understand ourselves when we see our reflection in someone else." Her breath caught. The moment stretched, as delicate as a thread pulled too tightly. The air grew heavier, the world around them quieting. Neither of them moved, yet the space between them felt as if it had shifted forever. He looked away first, clearing his throat. "I had the gardeners stop maintaining it after she died. I couldn't bear to see it change. But now, perhaps it's time to let something new grow." Brenda's fingers brushed once more over the rose's stem. "Then, let it begin with this one." His gaze returned to her, softened now. "Will you help me tend it?" "I will," she said simply. They spent the next hour together in silence, side by side in the warm earth. Brenda unearthed the roots of the bush, trimming away the rot with a steady hand. Edward worked beside her, rolling up his sleeves, his palms unaccustomed to soil, yet determined. They worked without words, the rhythm of their labor speaking more than language ever could. By the time they stood again, the rose bush had been cleared, fed, and watered. It stood proud once more, its delicate spine reaching toward the sun. "You have a gift," he said, brushing dirt from his cuff. "For mending things," she asked, smiling faintly, "for breathing life into what others have left behind." Brenda felt the warmth of his words settle into her, not like flattery, but like truth. She was about to reply when a sharp voice echoed from the far end of the path. "Well," it said crisply, "I must be dreaming. Edward Harrington with dirt under his nails." They turned as one. At the garden gate stood Mrs. Eunice Pembroke, widow of prestige, guardian of gossip, and long-time aspirant to the Harrington name. She was impeccably dressed in a travelling suit of navy silk, a veiled hat perched above her carefully arranged curls. Her eyes, grey and sharp as steel, moved from Edward to Brenda with surgical precision. Edward straightened. "Eunice, I wasn't aware you had returned to Newport." She stepped forward, lifting the hem of her skirt with practiced grace. "Just this morning. I came to pay my respects. I see I'm interrupting." Brenda stepped back instinctively, wiping her hands discreetly against her apron. "You remember Miss Collins," Edward said calmly. "She's here as a caretaker. For Henry." Mrs. Pembroke's smile was thin. "Of course. The woman from Crosswind Street. I heard the most fascinating things about your arrangement." Brenda met her gaze without blinking. "My arrangement is with the child, not the household." "How noble," Eunice replied, turning her attention back to Edward. "Darling, the invitations for the autumn charity gala have just been sent out. I do hope we can count on your attendance. The committee insists on your presence." "I'll consider it," he said, his voice cooled. Eunice's gaze lingered on Brenda once more before she turned to leave, her parasol tapping lightly against the stones. "Do take care in the garden," she said over her shoulder. "So many things tend to grow where they shouldn't." Her words trailed behind her like perfume, sweet, pointed, and impossible to ignore. Edward sighed, brushing a leaf from his lapel. "You'll find that Eunice has never learned to knock." "She doesn't need to," Brenda replied softly. "She's already certain the door belongs to her." He turned to her with a flicker of amusement. "And what do you believe, Miss Collins?" She looked back at the half-buried rose, now standing in the light. "I believe that even the most forgotten garden can bloom again if someone has the courage to care for it." His gaze held hers a moment longer. Then, with quiet reverence, he said, "Then let us begin again." And together they walked out of the garden, past the vines and statues and sun-warmed earth, their shadows long and side by side across the gravel. Behind them, the roses stirred in the wind, and the first bud of late summer opened its petals to the light. Newport, Rhode Island, early autumn of 1895. The days had grown shorter, the sea a deeper shade of iron, and the winds that curled around the marble balustrades of the Harrington estate carried a sharper chill. With the arrival of September, the rhythm of Newport shifted. The summer visitors faded, leaving behind only the most persistent social climbers and the oldest families, those who remained to attend luncheons, salons, and charity events designed not out of goodwill, but out of obligation and vanity. And it was among these velvet chairs and gilded parlours that the whispers began. They started like sea foam, light, insistent, and impossible to hold back. By the end of the second week, they had become waves. The seamstress, the boy's caretaker, she's still living in the house, you know, alone with him. Eyebrows arched, fans fluttered, teacups clinked with deliberate elegance. No one dared speak too loudly, but everyone listened. Brenda Collins's name, once unknown, now lingered like a stain on white lace. It was at Mrs. Pembroke's Wednesday salon that the first strike was carefully delivered. The widow sat at the head of a marble terrace overlooking the sea, surrounded by the usual circle of widowed cousins and society wives. Her gown was black silk with jet embroidery, her gloves thin and precise. She held her teacup with fingers trained not to tremble. "It's tragic, truly," she sighed, not naming anyone in particular, "the way some women confuse duty with ambition." Lady Ashcroft leaned closer. "You mean the caretaker?" "Oh, I would never say such a word aloud," Eunice replied sweetly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "But one wonders what exactly her role has become in that house. Edward has been so impressionable since his loss." By the following Sunday, Brenda could not enter the Harrington Library without encountering silence. The housemaid stopped mid-conversation when she passed. The butler, once courteous, now addressed her with clipped formality. The cook, Mrs. Temple, avoided her entirely, and still she endured it. She spent her mornings with Henry, who had grown stronger and more animated by the day. His laughter returned in gentle bursts, and he often reached for Brenda's hand without hesitation. He had begun to speak more freely, though only in Brenda's presence, as if his voice had found its safety only in her company. One afternoon she took him walking along the back lawn, where the roses had begun their final bloom before autumn. As he pointed to a bird's nest tucked among the hedges, Brenda felt the warmth of his small hand in hers. And when she turned, she saw Edward watching from the terrace, his arms folded, his gaze not stern, but quietly reverent. But even that comfort began to feel fragile. That evening, while returning from the kitchen with a tray of broth and buttered toast, Brenda passed by the parlour and heard voices behind the half-closed door. She paused only because her name was spoken, clearly, crisply, without affection. "She knows exactly what she's doing," said Mrs. Pembroke, her tone laced with honeyed contempt. "She walks through that house as if she belongs, as if Henry were hers. And Edward, well, he has always been drawn to women he can control. First the poet wife, now the docile seamstress." There was a murmur of agreement, followed by the clink of crystal. "I heard he bought her new gowns," said another voice. "She's barely educated," said Eunice, "hardly fit to host tea, let alone sit at his table." Brenda stepped back, her fingers tightening on the tray. Her throat burned, but she made no sound. She returned the tray to the kitchen and walked blindly to her room, her heart pounding with a pain far deeper than humiliation. It was betrayal. That night, she packed her things. The small wooden chest that held her belongings seemed even smaller than when she had arrived. Her journal, the grey shawl her mother had stitched, a pair of gloves and a simple blue dress. The room she had called her own for weeks now felt foreign, as if she had only ever been a guest in a story she did not belong to. Before dawn, she entered Henry's room one last time. He was still asleep, curled beneath the quilt she had mended. She sat beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead, memorizing the curve of his cheek and the shape of his lashes. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Forgive me." She rose, turned toward the door, and stopped. Henry had awoken. He was sitting upright, his eyes wide, his lower lip trembling. "You're leaving me?" he asked, his voice small, trembling, her heart shattered. "Henry, is it because of the people talking?" His voice cracked. "Because they don't like you here?" She knelt before him, taking his hands. "It's because they're hurting your father. And I don't want to bring more trouble to this house." "You're not trouble," he said fiercely. "You're the only one who makes it feel like home." Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Edward appeared in the doorway, dressed in a dark waistcoat, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. His gaze moved from the packed trunk to Brenda, then to his son. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice low. Brenda stood slowly, her hands still holding Henry's. "I heard them, Mr. Harrington. I heard what they're saying. About me, about you, about this house." Her voice trembled, but her spine remained straight. "And I won't be the reason your reputation suffers." Edward stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw was clenched with tension. "My reputation," he said slowly, "has endured far worse than whispers." "But Henry," she began. "I will not let society dictate who is welcome in my home," he interrupted. The boy gripped her hand tighter. "Please don't go," he begged. Brenda looked between them, her chest rising and falling with the weight of choice. The silence stretched. Then Edward spoke again, his voice quieter but firm. "If you stay, you do so as part of this household. Not in the shadows, not behind doors. I will not allow you to be shamed for the compassion you've given this family." She stared at him, stunned. "You would do that for me?" "I would do that," he replied, "because truth should never be the thing we hide, Miss Collins." Henry threw his arms around her waist, clinging to her as if he might never let go. Brenda closed her eyes and held him tightly, her soul torn open and rebuilt in a single breath. Outside the window, the first leaves of autumn began to fall, swirling in golden spirals against the cold stone walls. Within, the balance had shifted once more. Not by accident, not by scandal, but by the quiet defiance of those who choose love over silence. Newport, Rhode Island, mid-autumn of 1895. The wind had changed. The leaves that once danced like golden confetti along the manicured gardens of the Harrington estate now lay crumpled and still, as if mourning the warmth that had left with the last blush of summer. The house itself seemed quieter since Brenda's departure, despite the relentless ticking of clocks and the rustle of servants' movements echoing in polished halls. Yet the silence was not peace. For Edward Harrington, it was the hollow, unrelenting kind of silence that settled behind the ribs and echoed in every solitary breath. He sat in his study, sleeves rolled back, his tie undone, his desk cluttered with unopened letters and reports that no longer mattered. Across from him, the hearth blazed with carefully arranged logs, casting amber light on a room that had once felt secure. Now, it felt empty. She was gone. Not because he had asked her to leave, but because he hadn't stopped her. Because he hadn't said the words he'd carried in his chest since the first time her voice had soothed his son's tears. Words he had let rot in silence, hidden beneath pride and the suffocating weight of what Newport expected from a man like him. Now Henry spoke little. The boy's laughter had vanished again, as if the joy had been stitched into the seams of Brenda's dresses and carried away in her modest trunk. Meals were left untouched. Books remained closed. And Edward could no longer ignore the ache that bloomed in the space where her presence had once settled like sunlight. That morning he sat with pen in hand, staring at the page as if it were a battlefield. Brenda, he wrote, then paused. He didn't know how to begin. Not as a tycoon, not as a man accustomed to being obeyed. Only as himself, flawed, uncertain and terrified of what it meant to feel so deeply for a woman who had never asked for his fortune, only his honesty. Brenda, I find myself unable to walk through this house without seeing what your presence softened and what your absence has made unbearably sharp. Henry asks for you, not with words, but with silence. And his pen faltered, and I find myself missing you in ways I can no longer bear in silence. He stared at the words for a long time, then folded the letter carefully. He rang the bell for Mr. Cartwright, his trusted legal adviser, and the man who had managed his estate since his father's death. "Have this delivered to Miss Collins," Edward said simply. Mr. Cartwright accepted the envelope with a nod, but his eyes flickered briefly with something unreadable. "As you wish, sir," he replied. But the letter was never delivered. It remained in Cartwright's coat pocket, untouched, sealed, and buried beneath appointments and legal briefs. For he had seen the look in Edward's eyes, had witnessed the change in the boy, the shift in the house. And Cartwright, who had spent his entire life protecting legacy over emotion, understood what was at stake. Love was dangerous, he reasoned, and sentiment was a luxury only the poor could afford. Brenda, unaware of the letter, had returned to the edge of Newport, to a small room above Mrs. Hanley's dress shop, where she now worked hemming collars and repairing old wedding gowns. The work was honest, the wages modest, and the silence unbearable. Though she tried to bury herself in fabric and thread, nothing quieted the ache she carried. Henry's face haunted her thoughts, his fragile smile, the weight of his small hand in hers. And Edward, the man who had stood beside her in the garden and asked her in the quietest voice to begin again. She told herself she had done the right thing by leaving. That honor demanded distance. That affection, when spoken in the wrong place, became ammunition for crueler tongues, and yet every evening, when the shop closed and the street lamps flickered to life, she found herself looking toward the road that led back to the estate, hoping, dreading, longing. One cold evening, as she stitched by lamplight, the bell above the shop door rang furiously. Mrs. Hanley rushed down the stairs in her apron, breathless. "Brenda!" she cried. "There's been an accident. It's the Harrington boy." The world narrowed. Brenda stood so quickly that the stool beneath her clattered to the floor. "What happened?" she asked, her voice breaking. "He wandered into the stables. One of the mares was spooked. They say he fell. They've sent for you." Brenda didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and ran into the night, the wind slicing through her as if it had waited for this very moment to break open. The Harrington carriage was already waiting at the corner. She climbed in, her hands trembling, heart racing as each turn brought her closer to the estate she had vowed never to return to. When she arrived, the household was in chaos. Lamps burned in every corridor, servants whispered in clusters, and Mrs. Greaves wrung her hands by the main stair. Edward appeared at the top of the landing, his face drawn and pale. He descended swiftly when he saw her. "He's asking for you," he said, his voice raw. She ran past him without a word, up the stairs, down the familiar corridor, and into the room where Henry lay with a bandage around his brow and a bruise darkening one cheek. A doctor stood nearby, adjusting a vial of laudanum, but the boy's eyes opened as Brenda knelt beside him. "Don't leave me again," he whispered. Her tears fell freely now. "Never," she promised, holding his hand against her heart. "I'll never leave you." Edward stood silently in the doorway, watching her rock his son in her arms, and in that moment he knew he had nearly lost more than he could ever afford. He stepped inside, knelt beside them, and placed a hand on Brenda's shoulder. "I sent you a letter," he said softly. She looked up at him, eyes shimmering with disbelief. "I never received it." He turned toward the doctor and dismissed him quietly, then waited until the door had closed. "I told you I missed you," Edward continued, "that I needed you. Not for Henry, though he loves you as no one else, but for myself. Because this house without you is only stone and silence." Brenda searched his eyes, trembling with the weight of all she had carried in silence. "And if I had known you felt that way?" she asked. He reached into his coat and retrieved a fresh envelope. He had written it again, the very morning after the accident, when fear had burned away every trace of pride. "I'm not too late," he said. "Please tell me I'm not too late." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for his hand and laid it against Henry's chest, where his heartbeat pulsed beneath a layer of flannel and bruises. Then she leaned into Edward's shoulder, her breath warm against the crook of his neck, and the three of them remained there, in the quiet, in the firelight, in the fragile peace between sorrow and healing. Outside, the wind softened. The sea, always watching, seemed to hush. And somewhere in the darkness, the unopened letter still rested inside Mr. Cartwright's locked drawer, unread and forgotten, no longer needed, for the truth had been spoken aloud. Newport, Rhode Island, late autumn of 1895. The sky above the Harrington estate hung low and heavy, a curtain of grey that threatened storm. The trees stood bare, their branches skeletal against the pale horizon, and the sea beyond the cliffs rolled with quiet unrest. Inside the great house, the air had shifted, subtly, unmistakably. Something long buried stirred beneath the marble floors and velvet drapes, whispering truths that no longer wished to remain silent. Brenda moved through the halls with steady steps, her skirts brushing against cold stone as she returned to the place she once called sanctuary. The scent of pine from the kindled hearths, the distant ticking of the long case clock in the vestibule, the faint sound of Henry's voice echoing down the corridor, everything was as it had been. And yet, nothing was the same. Henry had recovered from the accident, but not without leaving behind traces of memory too strong for a child to carry alone. His eyes, once wide with innocence, now held a gravity far beyond his years, and Brenda, though she resumed her place at his side, no longer did so as a guest or caretaker. The weight of the bond between her and Edward had deepened, pulling them together with a force neither fully understood. It was in the nursery, one rain-slicked afternoon, that Henry looked up from his book and spoke words that would shatter the quiet lies of the house. "He told Mama to go out there," he whispered. Brenda, seated beside him, turned slowly. "Who did, sweetheart?" Henry's small fingers clutched the toy train in his lap. His voice was thin but certain. "Mr. Cartwright. He made her cry. I heard him say it. He said she'd embarrassed the family. Mama ran to the cliff after that." Brenda's blood ran cold. She knelt beside him, her voice trembling. "Did you see her fall?" Henry nodded once. "She slipped, but she was running. She was crying, and I think she didn't want to." He buried his face in her shoulder, and Brenda wrapped her arms around him, her heart pounding like thunder in her chest. For months, the house had whispered of tragedy, cloaked in polite denial. But here, in the arms of a child too young to lie, was the truth. That evening Brenda sought Edward in the study. He stood at the window watching the storm gather over the sea. A decanter of brandy sat untouched on the side table. and papers lay scattered across his desk. When he heard her footsteps, he turned, not with surprise, but with the weight of a man expecting something inevitable. "Henry remembers," she said quietly. His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "He remembers the day Annabel died. He remembers what Cartwright said to her, that she had embarrassed the family, that she ran after him, out to the cliffs." Edward's expression cracked, just slightly. "No, that can't be. Cartwright was in charge of the estate. He handled the legalities, the public narrative. He controlled the silence," Brenda interrupted. "But Henry saw what no one else did." Edward crossed the room in 2 strides, his voice low, rough. "Do you understand what you're suggesting? That the man I've trusted for over a decade, who managed my marriage, my inheritance, my son's future, drove my wife to her death?" Brenda looked up at him, her eyes steady, though her heart trembled. "I'm not suggesting. I'm telling you what your son remembers." He paced, running a hand through his hair, uncharacteristically disheveled. If this is true, then everything I've built was built on silence." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "Then it's time to tear the silence down." A storm cracked outside, lightning flashing over the sea. That night Edward summoned Cartwright under the pretext of discussing estate matters. Brenda remained in the sitting room with Henry, while beyond the doors voices rose behind the study walls. "You were supposed to protect this family," Edward said. "I did," came Cartwright's voice. "You were on the verge of ruin. She spoke in public, questioned your decisions, made enemies of your allies. You had no idea how close they were to withdrawing their investments. She was my wife. She was reckless." A pause. "And Brenda?" Edward asked, voice low. "What would you do with her? Cast her out as well? Humiliate her like you did Annabel?" Silence. And then Cartwright, colder now. "You're letting sentiment make you a fool, Edward. That woman, she's not your equal. She never will be. And you," Edward replied, "are no longer welcome in this house." The door opened moments later. Cartwright passed through the hallway, his coat gathered over his arm, his expression stiff with pride and fury. He did not look at Brenda. He did not look back. The following morning, the house breathed differently, as if some old ghost had finally exhaled. Brenda walked the eastern corridor, pausing before the double doors that had always remained locked. Annabel's chambers. She hesitated, her fingers resting on the brass handle, when Edward appeared beside her. "I had them open this morning," he said quietly. "I hadn't set foot inside since the day she died." Together they entered. The room smelled of lavender and faded roses. Dust motes floated in the light streaming through the sheer curtains. A vanity sat untouched, perfume bottles still aligned, a hairbrush lying where it had last been placed. The bed was neatly made, the mirror above it draped in gauze. Edward stood in the center of the room, staring at nothing. "She was lonely," he said. "I didn't see it then. I gave her a kingdom and never asked if she wanted to rule it." Brenda's voice was gentle. "Some women don't want kingdoms. They want a companion." He turned to her, his gaze raw. "And what do you want, Brenda?" She hesitated. "To be seen," she whispered. "Not for what I represent, not for what I can give or mend, but for who I am. A woman with a heart full of flaws and hope, who loves your son like her own, and who loves you more than she ever meant to." He stepped forward. Their hands met between them, his large and trembling, hers warm and sure. "I do see you," he said, his voice breaking. "And I have for longer than I've dared to admit." The room seemed to hold its breath. She reached up, brushing a lock of hair from his brow, her fingers trembling only slightly. "Then let the past rest, Edward. Let the shadows go." He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her palm with reverence. Outside, the storm had passed. The sky opened in soft gold, light spilling over the sea and the cliffs beyond. They stood together, not as a tycoon and a seamstress, but as two souls scarred by grief, stitched together by truth and tenderness. And in the quiet glow of morning, they let the silence finally break, replaced by something infinitely more powerful. Hope, Newport, Rhode Island, early November of 1895. A sharp wind swept through the bare branches of the trees surrounding the Harrington estate, scattering the last brittle leaves across the gravel paths like fragile remnants of something once splendid. The sea had grown colder, greyer, more secretive. Everything seemed to hush before winter's arrival, and within the stone walls of the house that had seen scandal, sorrow, and sudden hope, silence had taken a new shape, one that waited for decisions to be made. In the east wing, Brenda stood by the window of her modest room, her fingertips resting on the glass pane that fogged gently with her breath. Below, she could see Henry chasing fallen leaves in the garden with one of the younger footmen, laughter returning to his steps with each passing day. His cheeks were flushed, his scarf trailing behind him. It should have brought her peace. Instead, it filled her with an ache that had no name. She turned back to the letter in her hands, the paper thick, the seal pressed in red wax. It had arrived that morning, delivered by a man in a dark overcoat with a gold-tipped cane, who spoke with the refined accent of Boston's Beacon Hill. The letter was from Mrs. Thalia Wentworth, a patroness of the arts, known for funding scholarships for working-class women and restoring dignity to those often overlooked by society's circles. The letter was gracious, generous. It offered Brenda something she had never imagined possible, a chance to relocate to Boston, to oversee the creation of a fine sewing atelier for orphaned girls, to earn respect through work and skill, far from the gossip and cruel stares of Newport. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the letter down. A knock at her door drew her from thought. It was Edward. He stepped into the room with the gravity of a man carrying more than just news. His coat was still buttoned high, his gloves in one hand, and though he attempted a calm expression, his eyes betrayed him, storm-colored and restless. "We need to talk," he said gently. Brenda nodded and motioned toward the settee by the hearth, where a fire burned low. He did not sit immediately. He paced slowly, as though searching for words that might come without wounding. "I had a meeting this morning," he began. "A few members of the board, old family names, Cartwright allies mostly. They came to offer an opportunity, a merger that would stabilize the Harrington holdings and restore the family name in the eyes of the press." Brenda's eyes remained on him, unmoving. "There's a condition," he added, voice lower now. "A request, dressed as a suggestion." Her throat tightened. "They want you gone." The words landed like ice water, sharp and clear. "And how do they imagine I should go?" she asked quietly. He met her eyes. "They propose that you be offered a stipend and introduced to a gentleman in New York, a banker, widowed, discreet. They believe a marriage of convenience would resolve the tension." Brenda rose to her feet, spine straight, dignity wrapped around her like armor. "So that's what I am now," she said, "a transaction." "No," Edward said quickly, stepping toward her. "Not to me, never to me. Brenda," she shook her head, "you didn't stop them. You sat in a room and listened while they discussed how to erase me. I did not agree," he said firmly, "but they made it clear. If I refuse, the merger falls through, and with it, everything tied to my son's future, his inheritance, his education, his safety in a world built on power and perception." "And what am I to you in that world?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "A liability?" He flinched. She crossed the room and picked up the letter from Mrs. Wentworth, holding it out to him. "I received this today. Boston, a chance to lead, to teach, to live a life of meaning with no one questioning if I belong." He took the letter from her hand, reading quickly, then lowering it with a conflicted gaze. "That's what you want?" he asked. "A life without scandal, without us?" Her lips trembled. "I don't know. I want to be seen. I want to be more than a shadow in your house, a woman others whisper about when I leave the room." "You're more than that," he said, stepping closer. "To me, you're everything I didn't know I needed. You changed this house. You brought Henry back to life, and you brought me back to myself." She blinked back tears, but her voice remained steady. "Then why does it feel like I must still ask for permission to stay?" Edward looked down, shame flickering across his features. "Because I have lived too long protecting a name that was built on silence and pride. And because I am afraid. Afraid of losing what matters most if I do not play the game they've laid before me." Brenda drew a breath, letting it fill her chest, letting the decision rise in her heart. "I will not stay where I am not claimed," she said softly, "and I will not be hidden. I love your son, and I love you, but I will not choose a cage, no matter how gilded." Edward took her hands, his grip firm, almost desperate. "Give me until tomorrow," he said. "Come to the charity ball. I'll attend with whoever stands beside me as the truth, and if that person is not you, then I'll know I was never the man you believed me to be." She stared at him, her breath catching. "And if I do go?" she asked. His voice cracked. "Then I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn the right to follow." He let go of her hands, turned, and walked out. Brenda stood there in the firelight, alone once more. That night, she did not sleep. She laid the letter from Boston on her writing desk. She opened her small wooden box and found the pressed rose from the garden. She held it in her hand until dawn, asking no one in particular if love was meant to come at the cost of freedom, or if, perhaps, real love was the only freedom that ever mattered. And as the first light of morning broke across the sea, painting the cliffs in pale gold, she made her choice. One that would not be spoken in letters or promises, but in presence. Because sometimes the loudest answer is simply being there when it matters most. Newport, Rhode Island, mid-November of 1895. The chandeliers of the Pembroke estate sparkled like captive stars, refracting light through hundreds of crystal prisms. Laughter, stiff and rehearsed, floated beneath the vaulted ceilings, and the perfume of orchids mixed with the scent of waxed floors and champagne. It was the charity event of the season, an evening designed not only to raise funds for the restoration of the Newport Library, but to re-establish Mrs. Eunice Pembroke's place as the sovereign of social opinion. Outside, carriages lined the drive like a regiment awaiting inspection. Footmen opened doors with gloved precision. Inside, the ballroom glowed with opulence, ivory walls trimmed in gold leaf, musicians tucked behind a curtain of velvet, and guests dressed in the richest silks and satins Newport could summon. But despite the gowns and jewels, there was a hunger in the room, an anticipation that crackled beneath every curtsy and comment. For tonight, the widowed Tycoon would make his choice, either reaffirm his loyalty to the world that had made him or scandalize it forever. Brenda stood at the edge of her mirror in a small chamber above the ballroom. The gown she wore had once belonged to Annabel Harrington, though few would know it. The original embellishments had been removed, replaced with delicate embroidery she had sewn herself, silver threads trailing like ivy over the sapphire silk. It fit her not only in form, but in truth. Simple elegance, quiet strength. Her hair had been gathered at her nape in a chignon of soft waves. Around her throat was a modest necklace Edward had once given his wife, a single pearl pendant, and though her hands trembled as she adjusted her gloves, her gaze in the mirror held steady. There was a knock. She turned, and the door opened to reveal Edward. He wore a black tailcoat, perfectly fitted, with a crisp white shirt and a navy waistcoat patterned subtly with vines. His expression was unreadable at first, but when their eyes met, the storm in his gaze calmed. "You came," he said softly. She nodded. "I said I would." He offered his arm, and she took it. They descended the grand staircase in silence, every eye turning toward them, like sunflowers seeking the light. Murmurs rippled through the room, disbelief, confusion, outrage barely veiled behind fans and flutes of champagne. At the base of the staircase, Mrs. Pembroke stood in a crimson gown with garnet earrings that swung with the tension in her jaw. Her smile froze at the edges, lips twitching as if they could not decide between civility and disdain. "Mr. Harrington," she greeted. "And Miss Collins." Edward nodded. "Mrs. Pembroke." She extended a hand toward Brenda, who offered a graceful curtsy rather than a handshake, her dignity a shield that shimmered brighter than her gown. "I believe you know why we're here," Edward said, voice calm, firm, meant to carry. "Indeed," Eunice replied, tilting her head. "I expected you'd bring a guest, though. Not this one." Brenda did not flinch. She stood, poised beside the man whose name stirred rumors in every room. But now she would no longer be his shadow. Edward turned, and with deliberate purpose stepped onto the small platform where the orchestra had just paused between waltzes. He raised a hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, and the room hushed. "I've spent many years in this city. I've built railroads, raised capital, and buried sorrow. I have been praised for my success and judged for my silence. But tonight I choose not legacy nor reputation. I choose truth." Whispers began to rise, but he continued. "There has been much speculation about Miss Brenda Collins, about her place in my household, about her presence in my son's life." He turned to Brenda then, and for a moment the room disappeared. The musicians, the aristocrats, the candles, all faded into silence. "I loved once," he said, voice rough, "and lost. I thought I would never feel again what I had buried with Annabel. But life does not yield to our timetables. It breaks us, remakes us, when we least expect." He took Brenda's hand. "I stand before you tonight to declare what I should have said long ago. Brenda Collins is not my servant. She is not my scandal. She is the woman I love." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A crystal glass shattered somewhere near the orchestra. "She is to be my wife." Brenda's breath caught, though she had known deep down that he would not let fear dictate his soul. The ballroom erupted in a tempest of voices, some indignant, others stunned, a few genuinely moved. But before any protest could rise to dominance, a small voice pierced the din. "Mama!" Everyone turned. Henry stood by the entrance, dressed in a miniature formal suit, cheeks flushed, curls slightly tousled. He ran across the ballroom floor, past gowns, past objections, past shock, and threw his arms around Brenda's waist. "Mama," he whispered again, eyes shining. Brenda knelt slowly, cradling him. Her tears fell freely, not of sorrow, but of awe. Edward knelt beside them, arms encircling both. The three formed a tableau no fortune could purchase. Mrs. Pembroke, from her place near the stair, watched with lips pursed. She turned sharply and walked away, her heels echoing against the marble like a closing door. One by one, guests began to offer subdued applause. Not all clapped. Some turned their backs. Others whispered. But there were those who approached, quietly, cautiously, offering congratulations not out of obligation, but respect. Among them was Mrs. Thalia Wentworth, who placed a gloved hand on Brenda's arm and leaned in. "You made the braver choice," she whispered, and so did he. Later that evening, the three walked along the garden paths outside the Pembroke estate. The moon bathed the roses in silver, and the chill air carried no threat, only promise. "Do you think the world will forgive us?" Brenda asked softly. Edward looked down at her, his arm around her shoulders. "I'm not asking it to forgive us," he said. "I'm asking it to witness us." Henry reached up and placed one small hand in each of theirs. And beneath the stars, with truth no longer hidden and love no longer waiting, they walked forward, not as relics of scandal or survivors of sorrow, but as a family, born not of wealth, but of courage and truth. Boston, Massachusetts, spring of 1903. The lilacs had returned early that year, their scent floating through the open windows of the Harrington home on Commonwealth Avenue. Children's laughter drifted from the garden below, carried by a breeze soft with memory. The world had changed. Faster trains, electric lamps in the hallways, even talk of automobiles on the horizon. But some things, The things that mattered most had deepened rather than faded. Brenda Collins Harrington stood in the upstairs sewing room, sunlight casting gold across her table, illuminating the spools of thread and fine muslin she was preparing for the annual spring exhibition. It had been years since she stitched gowns for the ladies of Bellevue Avenue, but her hands had not forgotten. Now she taught others, young women like she once was, how to transform cloth into dignity, labor into freedom. From downstairs came a familiar voice, low and steady. "Is Mama still hiding behind her needles?" Edward called with warmth. Brenda smiled, smoothing her skirts before walking down to meet him. He waited at the bottom of the staircase, hair silvering at the temples, but his eyes still the same storm-colored gaze that had once made her breath falter in Newport. He took her hand, kissed her knuckles. "I told you," she teased. "I have 3 more ribbons to finish before the girls present their work." "And I told you," he said, mock stern. "You promised me 10 minutes of your day. The rest is shared with the entire school." Brenda's School for Working-Class Girls had grown into a cornerstone of Boston's education reform. Edward had funded it with quiet pride, never seeking attention, only insisting on the marble plaque by the door. "In honor of every woman told she does not belong." Footsteps thundered through the hallway, and a blur of curls and giggles ran straight into Brenda's skirts. "Careful," she said, scooping the child into her arms. It was Annabelle, their youngest, named not only for Edward's late wife, but for the resilience that linked generations of women. She had Brenda's clear eyes and Edward's stubborn chin, and a voice that often carried across gardens and galleries without the need of a megaphone. Behind her came Henry, now 15, taller every day, sleeves too short again. He moved with the grace of someone no longer haunted by shadows. He still had bad dreams sometimes, but they no longer controlled him. He played the violin, wrote poetry he would never admit aloud, and called Brenda Mama without hesitation, without correction. "Miss Wentworth is arriving soon," he announced. "She's bringing the new board member for dinner." Brenda raised a brow. "And who told you that?" Annabelle whispered loudly. "The butler said she looks like a duchess." Edward laughed. "Then we should behave like royalty." But there was no crown in this house, no titles carved in stone, only warmth, laughter, and the quiet power of choosing love each day. That night, they dined beneath gaslight, clinking glasses not with nobility, but with gratitude. Mrs. Thalia Wentworth, still sharp-eyed despite the years, took Brenda's hand before leaving. "You've built more than a home," she said. "You've rewritten a rule-book society swore could not be changed." And yet, not every soul had embraced change. Far from Boston, back in Newport, Mrs. Eunice Pembroke lived alone in the great house that once echoed with ambition. Her soirees had lost their shine. Her name, though still spoken in drawing rooms, was no longer feared, only remembered, with a tinge of pity. The price of pride, it seemed, was silence. Mr. Cartwright, Edward's former advisor, had been quietly removed from the company years before. His belief that power could be maintained through control had proven his undoing when Edward restructured the firm and named Brenda as co-chair of the foundation that bore the Harrington name. Spring faded into summer. On the steps of the schoolhouse, Brenda sat one morning with Henry on one side and little Annabelle on the other. A newspaper lay across her lap, the headline proclaiming, "First female board elected to Boston's school commission." Henry leaned his head on her shoulder. "Do you ever miss Newport?" he asked. Brenda thought for a moment. "I miss the sea," she said, "but not the silence." He nodded, understanding more than his years. Annabelle looked up. "Tell me again how you met Papa." Brenda laughed. "He was very important and very grumpy." "And I was lost," Henry added softly. "But she found me." Edward stood watching them from the doorway, arms crossed, eyes full. 8 years had passed. They had not been perfect. There had been doubts, illnesses, losses, reconciliations, but the bond forged in defiance of fear had only grown stronger. Love, they had learned, was not what rescued you. It was what you chose after the rescue. And so, beneath a changing sky and the slow hum of a city in bloom, the woman once dismissed as a scandal and the man once enslaved to legacy sat side by side, not as myth, not as legend, but as a family, unbreakable, unforgotten, and finally, unafraid. Sometimes, the greatest victories are not won in boardrooms or ballrooms, but in the quiet courage of choosing love over fear, truth over reputation, and kindness over pride. Brenda and Edward's story is more than a romance. It's a reminder that second chances are real, that broken hearts can heal, and that a woman's worth is never defined by her status, but by her strength. Their love wasn't born of wealth, but of small acts of compassion that grew into a legacy of change. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in love that overcomes every barrier, let us know by writing the word courage in the comments. That way, we'll know you walked with Brenda all the way to the end. And if you felt something stir in your soul, share this video with someone who still believes in love, or maybe needs to believe again. We invite you to watch the other heartfelt stories we've carefully selected for you. You'll find them right here, in the cards. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until the next story, keep believing in love that defies the rules.